everyone, it's Brian Balfour, founder and CEO of Reforge. Welcome back to another episode of Unsolicited Feedback. In this episode, I am joined by my co-host, Fareed Mosavat. And if you listen to our last episode, oh man, we build on the last episode, a lot of connecting dots here, where we talk about two big topics. It's been the week of the AI Manifesto memos, kind of following Toby's memo at Shopify about how they need to become an AI native company, followed by Box's CEO, Facebook, Duolingo. Fareed and I break all of those memos down and create some frameworks on how to deal with this shift to an AI native world. In addition to that, we do another 180 and talk about the new AI social product that Meta has released this week, what we think the strategy is behind it, whether or not we think it's going to succeed and why. But before we get into the full episode, if you've ever been a PM, you've probably experienced this nightmare. Sales is saying you need to build X because a customer said Y, but you're stuck needing answers. Is that what they actually said? How many others have said something similar? What segment of customers said it? Have we ever heard this from other feedback sources? What's the upside or downside? The list goes on. To answer, you're stuck sifting through sales call transcripts, support threads, going through your CRM, product analytics, trying to piece together all of this information into some validation. But let's be honest, you probably skip all of that because you're swamped and you have tight goals and not a lot of time. Well, look, we can help. Reforge Insight Analytics just launched a new feature called Agentic Chat. Our previous chat sat on top of all of your customer feedback, did a good job at answering questions simply, but with Agentic Chat, it reasons, plans, and iterates through your request. And what this does is enables a few things. One, you can get instant answers to really complex, multi-dimensional questions. Things like, what are the top issues from customers that churned in this last quarter, and how did that compare to the quarter before that? You can also explore, segment, compare, visualize all in one thread. And it even incorporates all of your unique company context like competitors, the different features and products you offer for on-the-spot, really personalized answers. If you want to check this product out, Reforge Insight Analytics, just go to our website, reforge.com, click that book a demo button. I will give you a demo personally myself. Other than that, enjoy the episode.
It is the week of the memo.
It's the week of the memo.
It's the week of the memo.
Everybody must have been listening to our last episode, Fareed.
Maybe. You know, it's funny. We see ourselves in Silicon Valley as a bunch of contrarian independent thinkers, but often there are these like memes and trends that move through at breakneck speed all at the same time. You know, Toby sort of set the tone at Shopify a few weeks ago, and now it seems like every CEO is launching or publicly sharing their AI manifesto or AI memo into the wild. And they're all a little similar, but there are some interesting nuances and differences. And I think that it's about time we dive into this topic. We mentioned it briefly last week.
Yeah, we mentioned it in the last episode. I will say that I joke about the people listening to our last episode. We did strike a chord in the last episode because I had multiple folks reach out to me. In the last episode, if you haven't listened to it yet, we really talked about this great divide between the companies who are making big, bold moves to become quote unquote more AI native and those that are limping along. And one of the core sticky points is legal, security, data being the ones to essentially set the pace, set the tone, and how that's a little bit problematic. And I had multiple folks reach out to me being like, it's so painful. You have no idea. Commiserating, essentially. We did mention in the last episode this memo, this manifesto by Toby setting a tone. And then I think this week we saw one from Duolingo, a version of it from Box's CEO, Aaron Levy. And there was also kind of one from Facebook too, correct?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the Facebook one was more Mark's letter to shareholders in the earnings report for Meta, but it has a lot of the same tone and conversation, though a little bit more product focused about what the business is doing with AI, which I think is pretty interesting as well.
Yeah. So why do you think Toby issued that in the first place? Why do you think he felt the need to do it, and the other CEOs kind of following along? Because I think we're going to see more of these. I think it's going to see a ton more of these.
No, I think it's going to become if you don't have an AI memo, then what are you really doing? And it's certainly in the companies that I've been working with has become a major topic of conversation. And I think one of it is that AI usage and adoption lumpy. Think about the adoption curve of any technology. There are early adopters, there are early majority, late majority, etc. And within companies, in terms of people's individual usage of these tools, is very lumpy. Right? There are some early adopters inside these companies who are using them and testing things out, but maybe they don't feel like they have permission. Maybe they feel like they need to hide it because they don't want other people to figure out their secrets. Or even worse, they're afraid they're going to get in trouble. And so
100%. I talked to multiple people on that this past week, by the way, on that front. Yes, 100%.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I feel that sometimes. When I'm using these tools, sometimes I'm like, am I breaking a rule? Am I doing something wrong? But I've just decided personally that forgiveness over permission, got to use the things that accelerate your work. So I think one is the lumpiness of adoption, and the second is permission. And so those are two things. I'm sure there are others. And so I believe that I think what Toby's trying to do and sort of, set the tone on this is say, not only do you have permission, you have a responsibility to do this. That it can't just be, oh, I'm curious about AI, I'll dabble around. It's more an expectation. And I said this last week, but I think I'll say it again. I think what he's trying to do is accelerate the inevitable. Let's assume AI is everything we think it is, that it is a huge productivity boost, and it will make a huge difference for the people who choose to use it versus those who don't. Eventually, you'll see that in their performance. Right? Might take 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Performance takes time to really manifest because you have to have repeated successes. But the expectation is those who use it are going to accelerate much more quickly than those who don't. And I think what he's sort of saying is, don't wait for that to happen. Everybody needs to get on board and it needs to happen immediately.
Yeah. So I think we each have our own mini frameworks we've extracted from all of these memos, which I think we should share and compare and contrast. And then I want to afterwards talk about how effective do we think this is going to be, right?
Yeah.
Like at that stage, and what else, and what else needs to happen? Because I know there's other efforts going on inside the company.
So the first one that I'm seeing I don't know if I'm seeing this in the memos, but this is more of a personal view on how to best make AI adoption within organizations happen. And it comes to the fact of giving permission, but also making sure it's not hidden in the corners in individual people, which is what I would call it's a lot like the loops we built around growth in experimentation for product features, which is just like building a learning loop around the usage of these tools. So it's not like in the product sense, you'd say you have a hypothesis, you build an experiment, you measure the results, and you decide what to do next with it. The learning loop around growth or product development. It's really a learning loop around the use of tools for productivity. What I'm calling this experiment, learn, share loop around AI stuff, right? And creating opportunities for that. My thinking is it's not only your responsibility to use this stuff and experiment with it yourself, but that you have to share the use cases broadly and create forums and opportunities for that sharing. I think that's dependent on the company, what the best way to do that. Is it lunch and learns or Slack channels or Notion docs? But not just sharing the successes, also sharing the things that don't work or the false starts that you've had. So I think that's a big one, which is how do you create, peer-to-peer learning and experiment loops within the company, and not only bottoms up, but actually saying, hey, we need to experiment with this. Who's going to take it on, do it, and then share it?
I think there's 5 layers. There's ownership, expectations, directives, accountability, and constraints.
Okay.
And I think Toby's hit on most of these, and the other ones did as well, but missing the pieces. So ownership is, okay, who owns this? And Toby made it very clear by, one, him issuing the memo that he is owning the change, but it's also on everybody else. 2 is he gave very clear expectations in the memo of what he thought was to happen. He followed that up with 3, some very specific directives to match to those expectations. 4, he stated some accountability mechanisms. This is one of the things that we've seen in some of them, in the sense of we're going to integrate these into performance reviews, pieces like that. And then the final one, which I think is the most important, and there's a couple good examples, is constraints. Because I think to your learn loop, I don't think this change is going to happen unless there is some massive forcing mechanism. I think in the Shopify one, it's before you get more resources, you have to prove to us that you are not able to accomplish this with AI. In other ones, it was like, we will not be hiring contractors to do the things that we think AI can happen. And I know of another one, I don't want to expose the company name, which is they have an explicit rule internally that every team, they have benchmarked against other companies of similar revenue size and have created a ceiling of our teams can only be as 20% as big as those like pre-AI alternatives, and as a forcing mechanism. And they gave me an example of they were trying to expand the finance and accounting team, and the forcing mechanism actually what the end result was, everybody learned how to essentially write SQL with AI to get their answers questions, because they weren't allowed to expand. They weren't allowed to expand the team. And so I think that last one's unbelievably important, because we could treat this like a product or a marketing problem, right? Where there's different audience segments there's different ICPs within our company, and we have to have different plans for those different ICPs.
Okay.
There's the leaders, which I think you're mentioning, which is like, okay, there's people who are going to proactively, play with this stuff and really go after it. There's I don't mean this in a bad sense. There's the followers, right, who aren't going to be the first ones to experiment, and they kind of need the examples and the support. And then there's going to be the laggards, and the laggards are the ones that are going to drag their feet, maybe not completely adjust. And I think the strategies differ for all of them, right? The leaders, right, you kind of have to find a way to get out of their way, but in a larger company, in a safe way, right? Yes, data security, legal, they have an important job to do, but their job is to ultimately play defense. And if you let defense take over, right, progress just comes to a slowing halt. So the question is, how do you do that? How do you get out of their way? The followers, I think the question is, how do you support them? And I actually think this is where Toby's memo, I found the biggest gap, which is he's assuming that everybody is in the leader camp and will self-learn all of this stuff. And I actually don't believe that's going to happen.
That might be a company cultural value that you want to have, and that's fine.
Exactly. Yes.
But I don't think you see some nuances and differences in some of the others. I think Duolingo explicitly mentions that we're going to create opportunities for you to learn and push this stuff out. So it's like create opportunities for followers. And also, I think to not narrow, but focus the efforts of the leaders, right? Which is what I mean by like, you don't just let everybody in a growth org run whatever experiments they want. You want to have focused effort. So what are you identifying the key opportunities around, and are you actually doing those things, right? I think is important. Since we're laying it all out, you laid out your framework. I'll say the way I've been thinking about it is more like, what recommendations would I have to an organization trying to really make some AI transformation? So the first one is the one I already mentioned, which is educate, experiment, and share. So creating learning loops in the organization. So how do you do that? And I think every company is going to have to find their own unique way that works for them. The second is eliminating barriers to adoption. This is basically what we spent all of last week's episode talking about.
Right.
The next comes to your accountability piece, which is what I'm calling putting AI on the scorecard. So not just in performance reviews, but also mandating top down in terms of roadmaps, what you expect to see in terms of customer-facing features, employee evaluation, headcount evaluation, that all of that is sort of like making sure you have a scorecard that involves AI. It's not business as usual. You're trying to accelerate a change, a cultural change, an operational change, and a product change all at the same time, which requires top-down driving and scorecard, putting it on the scorecard. The next one is sort of related to this one, which I think is really important. And I think Toby set a good example of this. And I actually really liked Aaron Levy did a follow-up memo where he talks specifically about this, which is what I'm calling lead from the top, which is nobody likes a mandate that's like, all of you should be doing your work differently. My job doesn't change, And so I think this is one of those like moving from just bottoms up to also top down, sharing and involvement in these things. So don't expect the team just to do this. CEOs and especially leadership teams need to practice and need to be part of the change. I think that one's really important. I think probably the place where adoption might be the lumpiest is sort of in senior leadership, management, etc. And then the last one is important to me, which I'm calling top line versus bottom line. I like
this one the best when you sent me the notes, by the way. Yeah.
So a lot of the memos mentioned removing drudgery or getting rid of like junk work. And I think that's great. Like, it's the obvious place, right? Like, let's not spend a bunch of time doing easy to replicate work. Let's remove the, pushing papers around, moving JIRA tickets from here to there, writing the same SQL queries over and over again. I think that's great. And efficiency matters, but you don't win through efficiency. Like,
exactly.
You can be better through efficiency. But I think the key thing, and one thing is what are the opportunities that are created because of these tools, not just in terms of new product experiences, but instead of just looking at, well, I'm going to take away drudgery in the work we already do, I would ask the question, what work aren't we doing because it's too much of a pain in the ass? And what opportunities would that unlock? And I think a good example is Duolingo just announced that they release content for like 140 languages for non-English learners to learn English. And that's a really complicated problem, right? Because English is the number one language, I think, worldwide that people want to learn. But those people speak a variety of other things, and handwriting all that content would have been cost prohibitive or
we should
impossible.
Come back.
And
we should
so
come back
I think
to that
that's
because
an interesting example.
Yeah, we should come back to that because they're getting some negative responses and press to it as well. So it hasn't all been positive, and
right.
we can talk about that. But I want to double click on this point because the way that I thought about it was you can apply AI internally to either value capture or value creation. And I think the first wave of applying AI has been mostly around value capture, right? That most companies are applying AI in some way, shape, or form around customer support, as an example, to drastically cut costs. And it's been about a bottom line thing, as you point out. It's how do we cut these costs, extract out? But you're right, like you do not win by that. And so to our episode last week about this separation, the great corporate AI divide, the ones that truly embrace it and start to separate themselves from the pack, from the others, I think it's going to come from a place of figuring out how to apply AI internally to the parts of your company that are around value creation. And that's part of why I'm so excited to still be doing Reforge in this place, because we mostly interact with product teams, and product teams are at the center of value creation. I think that's where the separation truly occurs. That's where the compounding returns come from, is applying it in the value creation parts of your business versus the value capture parts.
Yeah, and I think that's what I think is being can get lost in these memos. They sometimes some of them felt a little scoldy. Like, stop spending money, stop hiring people. If I were writing one, I'm not a CEO, it would be more like, I think I really liked Darren Levy's tone, which was, we're going to reinvest the savings back into the teams. We are going to focus on the things that help us create new value for our customers. That this is not just a how we work and how do we save money thing, but rather a meaningful opportunity to do things we could have never done before. And I really liked that tone. And look, ultimately, each follower, in your parlance of the leaders versus followers, Toby was a leader. It's hard to lead. It's a scary thing to do. I think that message is starting to get refined in each of the followers and moving towards different types of messages, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. I want to go back to your point you mentioned earlier on culture change, because I actually do think that's a key question, is that every company probably needs to ask themselves is, hey, are we going to view this as something that changes our foundational cultural pillars? If yes, that starts to dictate a lot. For example, changing culture is crazy hard. It helps frame how hard of a challenge this is going to be and who needs to own it. Because I haven't seen culture changes unless it's owned by the founders and or CEO. Yeah. And then look, maybe the right answer for these companies is actually it doesn't change the culture of our entire company, but it does change the culture of a specific function or team or how they operate. And then at that point that also dictates who needs to own that and who needs to drive the change. But I think to the other piece that we mentioned last week is culture is really dictated by a density of people operating in a similar way. So back to the framework of the leaders, followers, and laggards. And I think the hardest part of all of this, and probably the place that a lot of companies will have a hard time pulling the trigger on, is that for the laggards, what do you do with them that are dragging their feet? Do you exit them? Because as you said, you can't do a culture change unless the supermajority is on board making the change. I also think that also points to the followers, the middle camp. Whether or not you can convert the habits of the followers, that middle group, is going to make or break this, because the leaders are never the majority of the company. So the question of like, do you get the majority of the company over the line to make this shift is really in that middle group, those followers that need a little bit of support, more guidance in order to make the shift. And as a result, what are you doing for them? How are you getting them over the line to make this shift? And so I think that culture change is actually a really important question of just, how are you internally viewing this as a problem? Is this just a mere productivity operational change, or do you think this actually changes some roots of how you've built the company today?
Yeah. So I wish I could dig up the article, but a CEO I work with right now, Greg Strickland at Ignition, shared this HBR article that talked about certain common cultural aspects.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think there are moments when you have to shift your culture in order to make a change in an organization. One of them that was described as a cultural value that some orgs value is safety. So the idea of safety being like, we're like, think about a company doing a really complex industrial process where it's really important that every step works, and that things are, predictable, that they are well understood. So safety is sort of at odds with what I would call learning or experimentation. So if you're in a company that values safety, or in part of the organization that does, let's talk about security, et cetera. These are literally your jobs at this company, is safety of the organization, safety of our financials, et cetera. You might need to actually drive a cultural shift, which is, we are willing to accept a certain error rate here, or a certain risk rate, because the value unlocked on the experimentation and learning side is so high. So I don't think you can do this without some amount of cultural shift, because of what we talked about last week, which is that these learning loops only goes as fast as the slowest piece of the puzzle. So if your culture isn't attuned to that, it will need to be in order for this to happen, because like we talked about many weeks ago, this is all quicksand. The world, it's changing quickly. The product capabilities, what the state of the art is, what you can and can't do with it, is changing so quickly that being overly methodical is a huge risk. So I think companies that have that as a culture are going to have to change them to drive this top down, because cultural change doesn't happen bottoms up, really.
Yeah. I just found the article you were talking about, because I know Casey Winters wrote about this when they had to redefine their cultural values at Eventbrite after the whole COVID stage. And the dimensions were secretive versus transparent. So do you default make things need to know or try to share? Is it for profit or for good? Independent versus interdependent. So do you encourage people to move on their own or build consensus so everyone rows in the same direction? Stability versus flexibility. So do you try to keep the strategy the same or encourage pivots?
Yeah.
Pretty top of mind right now, given how, right? Is it your whole self or versus focused on the work? Is it tops up down versus bottoms up? Or is it individual versus team? Do you reward everyone on the team the same, or provide more rewards to those who deliver more impact? I'll drop the links in the show notes and stuff to these two articles. But I'm reminding myself of these dimensions, and I can clearly see how, if you're on one side of this dimension pre-AI, how AI dictates a need to shift to the other end of the spectrum in order to make the change.
Yeah. This is why cultural change has to be universal, right? It has to be on the scorecard and how you think about evaluating performance, right? It's not clear how you would do this, bottoms up. If you did it bottoms up, you would probably stifle some of the leaders in a lot of ways, because they don't have permission or, have other things they're doing. And second, you're waiting for the inevitable, which is that there's these huge performance skews in your organization between your top performers and your medium performers. And then you have the harder cultural change, which is you have to start replacing people, which is what you're trying to avoid, I think, if you're doing this well, is you want the organization to shift with you, if at all possible.
What aspects of this do you think make or break success? Do you think there's elements of your framework or pieces of the equation that dictate success more than others?
Great question. I think I suspect it's the scorecard or constraints piece. At the end of the day,
I was just going to say that.
Groups act around their
we're humans.
We're
humans. Incentives. Hire, fire, promote, like that at the end of the day.
that, some people say culture is what you hire, fire, promote. I think that's right. And, I don't think it's 100% right, but it's mostly right. I think people generally act in terms of these incentives. I do think that that's the key piece. What are you pushing your organization to do? And I think some of the other stuff will happen as a net result. Now, one thing I would be careful about is if you just do the constraints. Hey, your performance review is based on your use of AI. In a competitive culture, I don't think you would get the learning loops inevitably. You'll get siloed learning loops, and you are trying to move the whole org. Joey in sales has figured out how to use AI to increase his own close rate and are better than their peers and can move forward. I do think it requires some shared incentive. So I do think that those are the two pieces. It's constraints, but creating the forums for like broader learning and adoption.
Yeah.
You want good ideas to spread. You can't let good ideas stay in their silos. I think that's the key piece.
Can you think of any other possible constraints to put into place? We mentioned a few that were mentioned, like benchmarking against companies of similar revenue size and forcing a team size constraint, not hiring contractors, proving that you can't use AI before you get additional resources. I think those are all good ones, but I've been trying to think about this category the most as what other possible constraints could you place to incentivize and force behavior change?
The thing, again, this is on the top line versus bottom line, is what constraints do you put on your product or customer-facing organizations to have AI impact customers, not just internal processes? So it's a little harder it's really easy to say like, okay, there's revenue per employee benchmark. G&A can't be over 15% of revenue or whatever it is. Those are pretty straightforward. It's harder to design an incentive that's like, you should ship an AI feature this quarter. I think that's probably wrong for every team, but it needs to be of the form, if there is a useful AI feature that you could build, you should build it. But I don't know how to frame that exactly. Any thoughts on that? Like, how would you, in a larger organization or company, try to drive customer-facing AI-driven innovation?
It's kind of like how, going back to the value creation versus capture, it's how do you reward application to value creation more than the value capture? Like, how would you design that in a way that's actually plausible to measure and do fairly?
Here's one. As a product leader or CEO, I will not look at designs or docs. I will only look at prototypes. That's one way to drive that. I will not look at anything I can't click through and use. And then the other is time constraints and volume. I will not look at anything that there isn't 4 of. I want 4 prototypes. It's creating process constraints that drive that wide exploration. That is, again, what was impossible without these tools. Not do the same thing you were doing faster, boring. Do more because you have these capabilities, I think could be one forcing function.
So it's more like constraints on the inputs versus the outputs. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Okay.
You do that, right? You guys are prototype driven development mostly, right?
Well, but a couple years ago, we totally rewrote our company values for the time that we were in as a company. In early mid days of Reforge, it was a writing heavy culture, and that kind of got away from us, where there was just too much emphasis, too much reward placed on incredibly detailed, long perfection of Notion docs. And so we had to totally shift it and say, everything has to come with some customer-facing visual with it. Now, this was actually before the prototyping tools came out, so this mostly had to do with wireframe mockups or Figma or whatever. Even a sketch, it was fine, because I just think people understand ideas, and the conversation is way more productive when you're looking at a picture of something that's customer facing versus words describing how it might impact internal stuff, business stuff.
Interesting for people trying to make these kinds of cultural changes is that you kind of pushed maybe an overcorrection and an extreme change. The writing culture had positive things. It meant that like you had really thought through the problem, that you were communicating really, really well, but it's headed in the wrong direction. And I like that you said, okay, well, I'm not going to just say, please make all docs under 500 words, which would be sort of an incremental change.
I think we tried that at one point and it was just totally failed. I think we tried that a little bit.
You went to the other bookend. You sort of did like a wide switch, right? And I do think that's uncomfortable. But what it does is it allows you to overcorrect to the other direction and then find the middle versus, well, let's take a baby step. Let's take a baby step. And I think that's why, again, this top-down directive is so important. Those kinds of bookend switches, like we're going to go from one extreme to another, are very hard. There's a lot of risk in doing that. As even a, senior director owning just one part of an organization, you kind of need buy-in from the top down on that. Like no one but you could have driven that. Everybody saw it as a problem, but you have to have like sort of the leader of the company say, we need to make a change around this.
Yeah. We explicitly said we would not reward that anymore and made that switch. We only have a little bit of time left, and I think we're going to do a total 180 again on our topics. Like we did last week. We should talk a little bit about Meta's AI social product they launched. I know you've had a little bit more time to poke around it than I have. So maybe you set this up, kind of give the context, explain the product, and then we'll dive in.
All right. So Meta just launched, I think a few days ago, it's not a new app. It's the app that was driving, I think, the Ray-Ban glasses called Meta AI, but really like launched, their version of a standalone AI app. I think there are a couple of things that are interesting about it, or at least different. One is it seems to really be focused on voice interaction. So as the primary mode of input, obviously you can type into it, etc., but it's on mobile. It is Meta, not, ChatGPT. So it is very like, voice focused. And the second is they're talking a lot about their technology as being, easier to adapt to individuals, certain situations. I didn't really feel any of that in the product. It didn't feel a ton different than ChatGPT's voice mode. Like maybe it was a little bit better of voice interaction. It tended to be more okay with me with being interrupted and going back and forth. I think they call it duplex voice. And they added a discover feed, which is a very Facebooky thing to do. I will just say my personal discover feed is not personal. It's just a bunch of interesting, prompts and responses, and you can kind of comment and fork those and like make them your own. So if somebody posts an image, you can reply with a new update to that prompt and it'll reply with an image of it. I think still pretty nascent, but I think they're really driving on how do we help the next billion people, because this is very Facebooky way of thinking about the world, adopt and use AI with this app. But I will say for me as a relatively early adopter, I haven't found anything in it that I like that would drive me to use it, if that makes sense. But that's because my use cases are work oriented. I would say the other thing is it is clear they want to focus on entertainment oriented use cases. At least that's what Mark's saying, and they're sort of pitching out in the world. I have not personally felt it manifest in the product yet.
Well, I think this gets to the number one thought that popped into my head, which was, look, let's be honest. Facebook's history with being successful on new like net 0 to 1 products in the social and entertainment space without acquiring or copying, I can't really think of much there. So like there's been a lot of attempts, there's been a lot of failures, but look, Instagram was acquired, WhatsApp was acquired, right? They copied a bunch of stuff from Snap around stories. And so even things like Facebook Marketplace, right, which was one of their successes inside Facebook, was relatively, it was a product market fit expansion kind of copy play. And even Threads, right? Threads was a copy play. And I think when we talked about Threads in the strategy with Casey, one of the big topics that came up was actually the strength, the superpower of Facebook around all their social and entertainment products is their growth team. That is, they are number one in the freaking world at that.
Driving all the adoption. Like they are incredibly good. They have almost every human on the planet on one of their properties. So yeah.
Yes. And essentially aiming that like crazy superpower that they have is where you see the successes, to the point I was skeptical on Threads, right? Like that I was probably the most skeptical out of the three of us.
Quick update, latest earnings, Threads, they said 350 million monthly active users,
right? And
that they have increased engagement significantly on the platform over the past few months, using all of their understanding and ability to drive better recommendations and usage. It's 1/3 of the way to my, if it doesn't have, I think it was like, if it doesn't have a billion, they won't bother, was sort of my bet, but well on its way to being a dominant, text platform. So
yeah,
good on
them. So, and they pointed they pointed that growth superpower at the growth machine at it. And so this is when I look at something like this, it's kind of like, I understand why internally they probably feel like they have to be taking bets here and net new zero bets, but it has definitely not been their muscle historically versus kind of waiting and monitoring to understand like what is like coming out and then really going after it and applying that growth machine. Now, they probably are like, well, there's only a limited number of places in the company that we can point that. They probably only have so many of those, the super talented leaders and barrels, as like Keith Verboy would put it, to point it at. But that was my first thought. I was like looking at this, I was just like, this is not leaning into the thing that they have historically been best at.
Yeah. But, well, I'm going to push back. Why do you think that is? Like, it's a voice version of, a ChatGPT like interface. They have their own model, etc. Fine. Like, to a casual user, they're all kind of the same. Like, we all know the nuances and differences between this model and that model and Claude and, Gemini and ChatGPT and Llama. But for your average user, they all kind of look the same. It's a box you type in or talk to that talks back or types back to you, answers questions, generates ideas, etc. It's a known product category, right?
Oh, so you think it's more known than new, like 0 to 1?
I think there's certainly a version that's like, it's about as good or similar to ChatGPT, and we're really good at driving a billion.
You feel like
they're
they're playing the copy play against Chat. Okay, interesting. Okay.
And
I did not view
the
other
thing they're good
at
is content recommendation, right? They're really good at that, and they are really good at personalization. So if there is a social play, we talked about this last week with ChatGPT. It's an interesting question. Like, who's more likely to win if it's, commodity assistant, not commodity, it's hard and expensive to build them, but like, let's say for trillion-dollar companies, roughly commodity thing with some sort of, I don't know what the right answer is, social discovery, interaction component. Is Facebook better at doing that? So I think they have a plausible play to at least build one of the dominant alternatives for this. I don't think people are going to use Meta AI to like write product specs. Just to be clear, you're starting to see a little bit of like divergence in what people are doing, right? Like Google towards search-oriented use cases with embedded searches, GPT for like deep research work, and Claude for like work-oriented, businessy sort of tasks. Maybe Meta's is, I want to have a, Star Wars bot I spend time in, talk to, or something like that. So entertainment-oriented use cases. So I think there is space for that.
I agree they're well positioned because, as we talked about in the episode around like Glean versus OpenAI and Anthropic, is that context is king. The people who own the models are commoditized, and the thing that differentiates the output is what context you have from the user. That's what generates better outputs. But the context you need is different for consumer use cases than it is for work and B2B use cases. Not only does Meta have all of the distribution and the growth superpower, but they also have way more of the consumer context that you would need to generate outputs for the use cases. But as we also discussed, it's not enough. There has to probably be some innovation on the social mechanism and the content output. And that's what's not clear to me in this is like that feels like the net new 0 to 1 thing that they haven't really proven that they can invent since the invention of Facebook. Everything since that they've essentially copied and tacked on. And so, I agree they are well positioned, but there's this third piece in addition to the growth in the context that needs some innovation muscle on it. And it's not clear to me that they've hit that yet.
So staying on the meta topic, and AI, but pivoting a little bit to sort of their driving top line stuff right now. Here's something I think Meta will be very, very successful at and win, which is, I'll just read a quick quote from the quarterly earnings update that Mark Zuckerberg posted on Facebook. The first opportunity is improved advertising. Our goal is to make it so any business can tell us what objective they're trying to achieve and how much they're willing to pay for each result, and we do the rest. And talk about something that Meta has the context, the understanding, and the will to do well. This, I think, is a huge opportunity for them, and more than other advertising platforms, because they understand both sides of the context so well. They understand what me as a consumer cares about, and they understand what the business wants to do and what their objectives are. And, there's a lot of companies building tools to auto-generate ad copy and creative and this kind of stuff. But imagine a world where one of the Facebook in-platform tools is briefly describe the business outcome you're looking for, tell me what your product is, and send me some collateral, some context, and how much you're willing to spend for a customer, and I'll just do the rest. You can imagine a world where you and I get totally different, perfectly unique, customized video, interactive ads. I mean, the opportunities are endless. And I think an interesting thing he said was, I think the percent of the economy that is advertising can grow because of this. It was it wasn't exactly that. And I think it's an interesting, as advertising gets better, it becomes a bigger portion of the economy. Is an interesting, hey, the TAM isn't what you think it is. It's actually bigger note. And so of all the other product innovation stuff, I can imagine that just improving that piece is a big lever for them. Just massive.
It triggered a good thought that OpenAI has done this partnership with Shopify. I think it's those two to do shopping native inside the chat GPT experience, and which does feel like one of the core consumer use cases around this. And so it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out. I don't know if that partnership was exclusive or what it was, but it's actually a pretty big indication to show who the market thinks is the leader right now in the consumer use cases, given that Shopify partnered with them. So I imagine there's some restrictions around that deal, but that's got to be probably one of the core use cases in whatever this new experience ends up looking like.
Yeah. So if you're building ad tools, I don't know, be afraid. Facebook has tended to swallow up all of the adjacent use cases around advertising, and they have the audience. So I think it's really, Facebook never ceases to surprise. Despite the 0 to 1 net new product question, they always find a way, and it is impressive. So I do think AI stuff unlocks a big opportunity. You may not even notice any change in the product, and it could make huge differences for their customers. So super interesting. Okay, last one on this. The other random thought I had coming out of Meta's AI app is what the hell is going on with Apple? If you're talking about consumer-facing, everybody else use cases, what is going on with Apple Intelligence? I haven't read up a lot on this, but it seems like they're lowering the bar for what it can do. It's becoming very clear that all the announcements that I was very hyped on when they were made around context and being able to take actions and Apple Intelligence, et cetera, are mostly vaporware, at least for now. And I'm very surprised they continue to seem to be dropping the ball while every other company is moving so quickly on this.
I think that the thing that I think you've actually said, and others that I've read too, is Apple does tend to be the last mover, and certainly where they're sitting in the ecosystem right now in control of the device, which I don't see going away. There's no indication that they're going to lose that part of the chain and touch point, that they can afford to be the last mover and innovate on that. And I bought that. I was like, okay, that makes sense. I'm starting to question it. I'm starting to question if something else is going on here, of they're just really struggling to essentially create the right experience and what's actually driving that inside the company. So, and that company tends to work on different hardware cycles, not software cycles, where AI is moving faster than software cycles. And so that's probably creating some of the feeling of where are they. But I've had the same feeling around other incumbents. I mentioned this last week of where is Figma on this whole AI prototyping front? They're more than
this 90... week. We'll find out soon, I hope.
Yeah. Oh, it's this week. Okay, that's super interesting.
Week. Sorry. Yeah. It'll be this week when this podcast goes out.
99% chance that they launch something, and I think, but for all the people that I've been talking to on the AI prototyping space, I don't know if Figma's realized how much user cred and love that they've lost because they've moved slower. I've talked to many people who struggle to see themselves going back to Figma. And so we'll see, right? Because they still have a massive footprint and a pretty strong habit with designers and that type of stuff. But I was a little bit surprised. That was an example. I was a little bit surprised of a product that a year ago, I was essentially, fanboying over when we talked about dev mode and all that type of stuff. I would not
no
have
one who's
predicted
a bigger Figma stan than me. Like from a business model, from a product strategy, from a opportunity to be huge perspective. But I think some of that, there's a big threat there.
Yeah.
It's actually the same threat that allowed them to win, which is like, hey, there's this like side thing you can kind of do that doesn't work that good yet, but eventually it might. That's, I think, the scary entry point for them around this.
Yeah, and so Apple probably can afford a longer time period of that because, once again, given where they sit in the ecosystem. But I think the point is that the window of affordance is, I think, a lot shorter than we realize or conclude from historical tech shifts and tech patterns.
Yeah, and the question becomes, their culture has deeply served them for decades now, right? What was it? Secrecy? What was the opposite side of secrecy? Like they're like the most
secrecy versus transparency.
Secrecy versus transparency. They're the most secretive company on planet Earth, have been for the longest time. And that's true internally in some ways as well as externally, right? And so I wonder, like, what would a Tim Cook memo look like? This is a topic for another time, or maybe for some of our listeners to think about, because I wonder whether the problem is rooted in some of the cultural, rigidity that's there. I don't know a ton about
These conversations come full circle with
exactly. Is what is the shift Apple would need to make to be successful here? Because they certainly have the talent. And they certainly have the opportunity
and the tech and
the tech and all of those things. And it's okay to be the slowest. I think that's fine. But like, what would it look like to take risk here? Yeah. I want to use Siri for this. Like, I really do. I do not like opening a separate app, ChatGPT, Meta AI, etc., to just ask a quick one-off question. The integration, like, I just want to be able to say, hey, Siri, how many cups of water should I add to a cup of jasmine rice? You know what I mean? And have it actually do the right thing. But, it doesn't. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we got to stop here because I got to run to a customer call. That was another good one. All right. Thanks, man. We'll talk soon.
Cheers. See you soon.
All right, everybody. We hope you enjoyed that episode. Just a reminder, if you enjoyed this episode, can you just give us a shout out? Leave a comment on that YouTube video. Give us a shout out on LinkedIn. Let us know what you liked about it, because Fareed and I are always looking for feedback and things that you either love or hate, and we would just love to hear from you. And just a reminder, if you are a product team going through this AI native shift, Reforge can help. Please check out reforge.com. We can help with either our learning product or our new tools to help you shift to an AI native world, including Reforge Insight Analytics. I'd love to give you a demo myself. So go to that website, click that book a demo button, and we'll see you there.